So, g'day, lovely people. I hope you are all doing well today, or this evening, or this morning, or I don't know how this works. Anyway, today I would like to talk to kind of a specific group of people. That is, people who suddenly find themselves with a necessity to go on call for a production service. Now, if you're in this position, I can kind of imagine maybe you don't quite know what being on call is, except that kind of senior engineers tend to do it and it seems to be necessary. You might be excited about it. Hopefully, you're excited about it, but you're also not sure you want to take on that responsibility and you're kind of a little bit worried about how it's going to affect your family time. I have some excellent news. This makes you perfectly normal, actually. Being on call is a weird situation, and I'm making this video for you in order to try and make you more familiar with this responsibility and hopefully more ambitious to take it on yourself. It's really kind of a nice way to further your engineering career, learn production systems, and take responsibility in a really visceral way for the customer experience. Now, personally, I've been on call in some fashion or other almost all of my software engineering career. And I've gone through many different iterations of this, things like kind of being unofficially on call, that is, called whenever something goes wrong late at night, to being on an engineering team that's set up and is managing it through a rotation. I've designed incident response processes at a couple of different companies, and I am now most recently the incident commander for a $1 billion European fashion company. It felt almost every part of being on call, from the oh god moment of actually breaking production systems to the 3 a.m. not this bug again drag, to the don't worry mate, I've also broken production before, challenge of helping another responder, somebody else who's broken production and kind of is figuring it out along the way. To prepare for 24/7, we probably should start kind of at the start and figure out why an organization even maintains this capability. Okay, so the story is essentially modern kind of internet-based businesses are expected to be available at all hours of the day. In many cases, the time at which the majority of customers are accessing this service is outside the hours of the people who are actually working on that service. A business might serve even the vast majority of its customers when there's no engineers actually at their desk. This means that the riskiest, often highest profit period is when there's no one there. And if something breaks, the business is burning trust with way more customers than might have happened when the engineers were actually there at their desk and were in a position to help. Leaving these things unmanaged is an untenable outcome for many businesses. They simply won't survive burning their customers' trust this way. Given this, it's really essential for these businesses to have somebody tasked with responding to these issues as they're reported. Now, if you have a business or a customer group that is primarily anchored in business hours, it's often not worth maintaining a 24/7 capability. It might still be worth having an on call team, but you just keep that on call team towards business hours, that is 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. Now, in my experience, the most effective on call teams operate in groups of maybe 5 or 6 people, and they're drawn from the application teams who maintain the code as well as the people who maintain the infrastructure definitions, or if there is a shared team, from that shared team. These team members are usually relatively senior and having experience with many different states of these applications, both good and bad, and can debug a really extensive range of failure modes for it. They often occupy other senior positions. They might be kind of writing architectural guidance or making technological choices, trade offs around technology. They usually work in shifts. Typically, they'll work for like a week in length, once every 5 to 6 weeks in rotation with their peers. When they're on shift, they'll carry a dedicated mobile device, mine is over there, hopefully with a high quality network. And they're expected to be during this period within a computer and actually online and debugging within about 5 to 30 minutes of receiving a notification. To be clear, this is a substantial commitment from these colleagues. As a consequence, I would expect that they are financially compensated, especially if it's a commitment that kind of goes beyond the normal expectations of software engineering in this organization. Now, as a kind of pro tip, if you've never done on call, the colleagues who do on call can be pretty intimidating. They're usually very experienced colleagues and they have lots of opinions based on that experience. And they can be, shall we say, stubborn about an approach as a consequence of being the ones who will ultimately pay the price if that approach is incorrect. However, it's important to remember that these people are ultimately human, and the best way to kind of join them and to take part in the conversations they're a part of is to try being on call. Okay, so today we'll discuss joining a healthy, high performing on call team as a new on call colleague. Setting up a new on call team is considerably more challenging. If you're interested in this, just let me know in the comment section wherever this video is, and I'll schedule it so I write it and teach you how to do it. Okay, so we usually think about being on call as responding to production issues, this kind of glory filled moment. However, in my experience, the key to being an influential on call team member is the same as being maybe an effective like fire marshal or a first aider. In all cases, it's about the preparation. What happens during the incident itself is driven as much by how much and how well we've prepared, rather than kind of our skill or our intellect or our ability under fire or any of that nonsense. There are some things that you should look into as a mechanism of preparing yourself for on call. And the first and kind of most important one is to figure out the boundary of your responsibility within your organization. As a background, there are usually multiple on call teams in any kind of large organization. That is, any organization that has more than maybe 50 engineers. Each of these engineers is responsible for a subset of production system and works with systems run by other teams. The first thing to look at is which part your team is responsible for. There should be like a list or something like a list of the applications, that is the actual binaries or runtimes or things that you run in production. Endpoint, so something exposed over DNS or something that has a series of route groups or ingresses or so. And businesses processes, something that your applications actually contribute to that delivers value for the customer. If you're joining a team that's been there a long time, what tends to happen is the documentation becomes a bit out of date and you may have to either write or update this documentation. Honestly, that's fine. It's an opportunity to learn that system's boundaries. You should figure out the stakeholders of each application, endpoint, or business process, as well as kind of how that stakeholder derives value of that process. This allows you to determine kind of how urgently to intervene, as well as how much risk you should take when you're actually responding. As a kind of a pro tip, when you're preparing for on-call, I at least have a series of canned responses for various different failure modes that I can copy paste quickly into chat, email, or any other communication tool. They're just stored as like files that are on disk, and I get them through something like a command cat pipe to Excel clipboard, and then I find these really useful to get some critical information out the way quickly and clearly, in a way that I otherwise really wouldn't while debugging these systems. Okay, so the next thing you need to do is learn the process. Organizations tend to have a clear boundary of separation between things that are maybe bad and things that are so bad they're incidents. Incidents are extraordinary by their very nature. We essentially immediately drop all other work, no matter what time of day it is, and we can requisition colleagues and demand that they immediately also drop their work. We're prepared to accept more risk when deploying changes, and we communicate in ways with each other that, frankly, might otherwise be considered rude or curt. We need to kind of really clearly delimit when we're entering this incident response mode versus any other normal part of the software delivery lifecycle. How we do this, it varies depending on the organization, but some of the things I've seen are maybe it's the creation of an incident artifact, something like an opsgenie page or a PagerDuty or a Jira ticket or something. Usually there's a unique language, something like this is an incident in a chat tool. You might create a new thread in a specific chat channel or a channel dedicated to the purpose of an incident. This can be pretty commonly encapsulated in something like a chat ops tool that's designed to make this easier. Once you're in the incident process, there are other things that you will need to learn how to do in order to go through this incident process as smoothly as possible. These are things like understanding how to involve another team if you need their assistance to figure out the issue. Updating a status page to let your non-technical stakeholders know what the state of the production system is. Notify colleagues of discoveries or interventions that you're making in order to collaborate with them on finding a solution. Marking the system as repaired once you've returned the system to a kind of stable or normal operation. Figuring out this stuff ahead of time will save you kind of an enormous amount of stress, if nothing else, of the incident, and allow you to quickly find the people that you need in order to help mitigate an issue. Okay, so recently I've seen a few people kind of struggle with these ChatOps tools. Or if the ChatOps tool is unavailable, they can't work an incident at all. This costs us time, which, if things are on fire, usually costs us money. Try and get really very familiar with these tools ahead of time. Practice them, create incidents, create fake incidents, real incidents, alerts, pages, whatever you need. Okay, so once you've figured out your responsibilities and how to interact with the process, the next thing that you need to do is figure out the responsibilities of those people who are kind of around you. Teams that operate services on which your service depends, as well as the stakeholders that are likely to reach out to you if they notice production is broken. People who need to be kind of notified if the system that you're responsible for becomes unavailable. In particular, you want to know how to communicate with these people in an emergency setting. If it's another on-call team, figure out what the team is called and what operation you need to do in order to include them in the response. If it's a stakeholder, figure out how they prefer to receive their kind of emergency updates and make sure that you encode in your process a way to deliver it in the way that they expect. Lastly, just a bit of advice, get to know these people and their perspectives. Meet them and introduce yourself, as well as introduce kind of how you tend to work during this incident response process. Sit with them and review how they view their applications, toolings, functions, so you can kind of understand their perspective during an incident response process. This will allow you to build a kind of mnemonic or playbook that you're able to use in this moment of anger that balances what they need with the urgency of the response you have to take. It also goes a really tremendous way to salve any feelings if you inadvertently communicate in a way that they consider terse or rude due to an incident, just as a consequence of the stress of the situation. Nice. Okay, so you figured out your area of responsibility, the process requirements, and the people who are around you. The next thing to do is to actually build the expertise in the software or infrastructure that's within the domain that you're responsible for. After all, you're the one that's going to need to debug it when something goes wrong. That's the point of this whole process. Some of the ways I've done this in the past include like reviewing the playbooks if there are any playbooks written about the service. They're essentially a review of previous failures that someone has been kind enough to write guidance for. And they're really invaluable both as a preparation, but also as a response tool. You also want to review the dashboards, the logs, the metrics, the traces, the whatever it is that you have. The telemetric data that the application generates is the same data that you're going to need to rely on when the system malfunctions. You'll need to be familiar with it and be able to spot differences from regular traffic. You'll also know how to access it in an emergency. Review the configurable aspects of the application. The application configuration is kind of anything that can be changed outside of a deployment and includes anything from maybe the number of replicas to whether or not a specific feature flag is enabled. You should be able to look at the current configuration, a history of how the configuration has changed, and really confidently update those values in the configuration. Deploy the application. Okay, so sometimes when something goes wrong, the only way to change it is to change the source code, the binary running in production. Whether this is a rollback to a previous version that you know was good, or a kind of fix forward where you're actually writing and merging a patch, deploying an application. You'll need to be familiar with this deployment process. Review previous incidents. So hopefully, as our colleagues have had their own challenges with our production applications, they've improved it so that we don't have to repeat these challenges. Still, incidents are really beautiful opportunities to learn how the software may deviate from what we expect. Reviewing past incidents can kind of help us understand if there's a pattern of things that routinely surprise us, where the sharp edges of our systems are. Once you've tried these tasks, I really encourage you to improve them even. Try and write a new playbook for a failure mode that you anticipate, or improve the view of some telemetry or graph, or improve the default for a configuration maybe. As you drive these improvements, you'll have a series of conversations with your colleagues that will teach you more than just going through the artifacts yourself. Okay, so understanding the significant projects in your area of responsibility. The reason this is necessary, one of the things that you'll notice very quickly as you go on call, is that the majority of issues that happen with production systems tend to be as a result of some change that's been recently introduced. This is normal. Software is incredibly complex and it's kind of really challenging to anticipate every change's consequences. The larger the change, the larger the kind of space for these unanticipated actions. A good way to get ahead of the, should we say, likely future failures is to keep an eye on things that are going to introduce the significant amount of change. This might include, for example, a significant change to the customer journey or significant re-architectures of the system, major upgrades of a runtime or a library or a framework or something, or a rewrite entirely of the service. This sometimes happens behind an API. Large projects also tend to run overdue, so engineers tend to be more likely to sacrifice the extra reliability work to make sure that that project is delivered on time. As an on-call team member, your job is not to get in the way of such a release, but rather try and empower the team as much as possible to make this release safe. You can go a long way towards safety by making sure that the project as it's being rolled out has a clear rollback plan and then a clear exit criteria as to when to invoke this rollback plan. Even if you have the owning team and that owning team is taking a really nice, healthy level of responsibility for a change, changes tend to go live during the, shall we say, the quiet periods of the day, and on-call team members are responsible for the same stuff during the busiest, highest impact periods of the day. At some point or other, you're going to be likely responsible for either adjusting or rolling back this change during an incident response. You need to prepare ahead of time, but making sure that the exit criteria and path are clear enough that you can execute them. Okay, lastly, in terms of preparation, there are things that we actually need to have in order to access and interact with production system. This includes, for example, a functioning laptop. Basically, you want to make sure that your laptop is charged and that all of the updates were installed before the shift starts. A functioning phone to receive some sort of notification. Like the laptop, make sure that you've updated it before the shift starts and make sure that it's charged. Otherwise, they tend to update at 3 in the morning, they lock, you never get the notification. Chargers. Sometimes something goes wrong, and it goes wrong for a really long time, long enough that our devices go flat. We need to be able to plug those devices into a socket. Network access to production. Okay, so hopefully you're not sleeping at the office, you're at home, and when you're at home, you're gonna get an incident, a notification that something is wrong. You need to have a stable internet connection, and ideally a cellular-based backup connection. Lastly, permission to access production. Most of the modern software companies, they have a permissions model where the permissions tend to degrade over time. Either a system will make you less privileged for the same operation or will remove your access entirely to some systems. And this is good. This is a healthy implementation of the principle of least privilege, but it does mean that we need to validate that we have some sufficient permissions to do what it is that we need to do before we go on shift. If you're a new colleague, it's good to have maybe something like a checklist to actually physically mark these things off before the shift. More experienced colleagues tend to kind of maintain a series of these out of habit. They also tend occasionally to forget. Okay, perfect. So the day has come. You have prepared, hopefully, as much as you can, but finally something has broken so badly that it requires your emergency intervention. Let's talk about what to do next. Okay, so before we get into it, let me give you a heads up. When you get that page, it's going to be, at least for me, extremely stressful. All the more so if things don't go smoothly. Maybe you have your manager asking a series of questions, or maybe your teammates just disappeared, or maybe you're alone and it's 4 in the morning. The stress that you feel is normal. It gets better after a few live incidents, but it never really goes away. Take a minute, take a deep breath, compose yourself, and then continue. No matter what happens next, you will be at your best with a clear-ish head. Okay, so the pager goes off. The first thing to do is understand the scope and magnitude of the issue. That lets us make decisions about what level of risk to tolerate when trying to fix it, as well as how many people to wake up or assign to try and help address it. Often an incident process has multiple kind of levels. If you're not sure, just pick the more severe one. You can always apologize later. Raise the incident at the appropriate severity and communicate your understanding of what the actual users are experiencing. Once you've done that, you need to intervene. The way in which you do this is you review the telemetry from your application and you leverage your engineering skills to understand what the pathological condition is. The specifics of debugging production really depend on the architecture of your system. There's a whole series of really good models to understand systems blind, for example, the use model, but debugging is really outside the scope of this conversation. Rather, what I want to mention is that you'll need to go through something called the OODA loop or OODA loop. The loop has multiple different steps. The first step is to observe. You'll need to figure out what you can by reviewing the actual telemetry of the system. You'll need to orient yourself, make that information useful by leveraging your knowledge of the system as well as the context around it. Maybe there was a sales period, or maybe there was a major release today. The next thing you'll need to do is decide, figure out what to do with that information. And the last one, act, is to intervene. You'll need to do something to try and fix it. You then repeat that whole process. As you're going through these steps, periodically make sure that you're communicating. Mostly useful if you've learned something new, if you've acted, or if you're about to act. And when you communicate statelessly. Essentially, statelessly means don't assume that anyone who's reading your communications has been following along so far, understand the system, or follows your hypothesis. As you're supplying numbers, be specific. For example, use 300 milliseconds rather than the relative, it's got huge latency. Lastly, be kind but direct. Be clear on what you're saying, but don't spend time on maybe this linguistic polish. Lastly, focus your investigation only on how to restore the production experience. Sometimes it's tempting to get lost in kind of the question of how production broke. It's a question that's distinct and really, frankly, less useful than how to restore the production experience. As a kind of tip, I've seen a lot of incidents in which a change has materially changed the performance characteristics of a production application. We don't usually figure this out. The moment in time we figure it out is when that peak traffic hits, or like a sales period or a peak period later on. In that case, the question is not what made the application slow, it is how far can we scale the application out? What are the bottlenecks? The latter is a much simpler question and will lead you on a path to restore production much more quickly. Once you've figured out a good intervention, you do it. Just do it and communicate it. If it doesn't work, roll it back and communicate that. Try something else. If you get stuck or you need help from another team, just include them. Okay, so hopefully at this point you'll be able to make some sort of change to production to bring about the restoration of the customer experience. You're not quite sure why usually the system broke at this point, but it's sufficiently stable that you can kind of take a breath. Okay, at this point, you got to try and see if you can figure out if the system is going to be stable over the next few hours. Essentially, your goal is to buy time in order to hand that problem back to the engineering team who owns it so that they can deal with it properly. If you need to intervene further in order to ensure the stability, make sure that you do so and just communicate that. Okay, if you've made changes to configuration or code or anything else, be sure to make sure that these changes are reflected in your system of control, your version control. Having someone deploy or update configuration and then undo all of your precious recovery work does not feel great. Okay, so once you're confident that the system is stable, mark it as repaired and communicate that you do not expect any further issues. Take a moment, write down everything that you think is relevant in some sort of notes or something for when you're later reviewing the incident, and then step away from the keyboard. Take your phone with you. While most systems behave after we've intervened, sometimes they don't. If they break again, you're going to be paged again, and you're going to be back into that process of restoration. Whew. So far, we have gone through preparation, and then we've leveraged that preparation to restore our production issue. Hey! We're all done, right? No, as you might guess. You're not off the hook just yet. Once the system has reached stability, we need to understand how it actually got into its failure condition so that we can adjust it to be less likely to do that in future, or adapt ourselves and our processes to restore that system much more quickly. We go through this understanding in something called a postmortem. We're not going to cover that now because it's pretty in-depth. We'll cover that one in a future video if you let me know in the comments. Okay, being on call can be a pretty hectic experience. In this post, we covered the background of being on call, the preparation, what to do in the incident, as well what to do immediately after. Honestly, I'm pretty confident if you go through this preparation yourselves, you'll be far more capable to help improve your user's experience than you would if you just kind of gave it a go. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this video at least somewhat useful or maybe mildly entertaining. If you want more mild entertainment, you can probably find it. This is the internet after all. However, me personally, I would appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button to join me in this kind of journey of sharing knowledge. If you didn't find it helpful, that's also fine. I would appreciate if you tell me why just by making a comment or so. I'm always looking to improve this process. Thank you very much, lovely people. I hope you have a good day or evening or morning. I don't know. When do people watch these videos? Bye!